Last episode, I covered the first week of the server and the beginnings of my nation, the People's Republic of Bogus, and my base within it, the city of Hypatia. My main goal this episode is to modernize my base. I'm talking about industrialization, capitalism, and the beginnings of modernity. First off, at this point in the server infrastructure was starting to get built everywhere. One of these major projects was the Klishkin Intercontinental Rail. I first and foremost plugged my base into the rail network and built a bridge to gain access to much of the world through safe overworld travel. My business on the server, the Imperial Free Trade Consortium, was making a lot of money, and I ran private deliveries for people. Due to the production from my fish farm being too much for my current 2-chest storage, I decided to expand the storage system, which meant I had to move my apple orchard. At the end of last episode, I captured some horses, which I put at the bottom of my base. Using a mod called Mini HUD, I was able to measure exactly how fast the horses ran. Due to increasing the treehouse-based concentration of buildings in my base, I decided to build out a bridge and clear out another tree to build a platform to set up my horse testing and breeding stable. I set up the stable itself, but also a path and some jump height testers. The way horse breeding works is when two horses breed, their traits are usually averaged and passed on to the offspring, but there's a chance that the traits are slightly better than average or slightly worse. In the 1.19 update, the chances of traits being better was increased, so it would be much easier to get maxed horses. The best horses you can get are a speed of about 14.23 meters per second, a jump height of 5.5 meters, and a health of 15.5 hearts. My goal was to get as close to these numbers as possible. To accelerate the growth rate of baby horses, I would need a wheat farm much greater than the old one I had off the coast. I decided to use the rest of the platform to build a much larger farm with automatic harvesting. Now, it took a fair amount of attempts to get the shape of the platforms just right for what I had in mind, and I did run out of dirt, but in the end I was able to set it all up. The design I planned made use of dispensers to harvest the wheat, which could be manually replanted. After I was finished, I finally took down the old wheat farm and moved the seeds and composters upstairs. I'm not totally sure why, but this specific dispenser never properly worked. It wouldn't retract the water back. It was a small issue, but the farm itself was still very effective. Next up, I wanted to upgrade my mob farm. When I first built it, it was one of the first and one of the fastest mob farms on the server, and provided a very good source of XP, but now the gold farm supplanted my XP need, and I was in much greater demand for gunpowder, so I decided to go with a water-flushing Nembon farm design. I set up a temporary storage room and towered up to the farm. Somewhere along clearing out the old farm, I decided to use TNT to speed up the job. It was a little strange blowing up a part of my base like that, but there was a cathartic joy to it. The next day, I started on the new farm. The only thing that remained the same was the soul sand water elevator and the flag. The way the new farm worked was there was 8 layers of spawning platforms. Starting on the top platform, whenever a dispenser would dispense water, it would activate an observer, which would send the signal to the layer below. There was 4 sets of these layers for 32 total spawning platforms, which would flush mobs down, eventually into the soul sand fire, and kill them. Because I had no apple farm at this point, I wanted to make another one, so next to the horse and wheat platform, I started building. Some issues I had with the old farm was that it was very annoying having to wait for the leaves to despawn, and it was annoying to have to deal with the big trees, so I made a water collection system, and I made a tree height limiter. Behind the scenes, I was breeding horses and selecting them for speed and jump. And at this point, after a few days, I had got horses that could go above 14 meters per second and can jump around 3 blocks. This sped up the deliveries that I could run, and made them a lot easier, especially in mountainous or hilly areas. Speaking of running deliveries, I was tired of doing them. They would take a long time for both me and the customers, and it would just be an unnecessary hassle for both parties. So I decided to make a self-serve shop. Due to the server's stricter stealing rules, I knew my shop would be protected. What better shop would there be than a few ships and a port? I started on the dock first, before making the first ship. This was the first time I built anything on the server for aesthetics, and I used several different wood types. I knew it would be crucial to provide a comfortable shopping experience and have people wanting to come back. The sales were a bit of a nightmare to make, but I eventually got the hang of it. I prepared renamed items that would show the price of the product inside chests. It was a massive success. I sold items that could be farmed automatically, which essentially, in a roundabout way, meant that I was AFKing for diamonds. The exception to this was sand, but due to the new and improved mob farm, I could gather crazy amounts of it with TNT. The next project I wanted was a honey farm. After many attempts, I got a bee nest from bone mealing trees and got to work on the build. This would be the second build meant for aesthetics, and the first part of the full modernization of Hypatia. The design was an ENX04 design that I was particularly fond of due to how cheap it was. The way the farm works, the bottles get cycled around the farm, and whenever they fill up with honey, they'll get picked up by a sorter, and a new bottle will be put in its place. For the exterior, I decided on a sandstone and stone brick palette with smooth stone outlines. In general, I wanted to create a somewhat nostalgic character for my new city, and that kind of palette harkens right back to the kinds of builds that were very popular around 10 years ago when I first started Minecraft. I filled up the farm with bottles and shears, and it started to produce. At this point, the only manual work I was doing for my shop was restocking and running occasional bulk deliveries. Due to the output of my fish farm from my fishing rod artifact, I decided to build another ship to sell my enchanted books. Pretty much the same design as the other ship, I was able to copy it pretty quickly. Just as fast as the second ship went up, customers started coming in. The next modernization project was to set up actual paths around my base. I wanted the bamboo slabs to act as a kind of natural ground, in place of where dirt would be, in order for my new city to maintain its treehouse aesthetic. I decided to build my new paths out of cobblestone following the nostalgic theme. Next, I wanted to make a turtle sanctuary to farm turtle scoots. I decided to use the new mangrove wood. The trees were tricky to cut down, so I used TNT. I wanted to also use quartz, so I used TNT. The new mob farm was, at this point, the backbone of my economy. The farm itself was a very simple design, so I integrated a mangrove propagule farm, in case I wanted to use mangrove again in the future, and a seagrass farm to breed the turtles with. This farm worked by having the player hold right-click with seagrass in their hand, which would breed up adult turtles. When baby turtles hatched from the eggs, they would fall into a collection system where they would grow up and drop their scoot. The exterior of this farm, which honestly was my favorite build on the server up until this point, was a combination of granite, deep slate, quartz, and mangrove, and it just made a really appealing color combination. I really liked this build. I think mangrove wood might take the place of spruce wood as my favorite wood type in the game, because it just blends so well with so many different types of other blocks. I loaded up the farm with turtles, gathered some seagrass, and ran the farm. In no time at all, I had Turtle Master. The next project was to make a better train station for Hypatia, as well as to modernize the exterior of the mob farm. I wanted the train station to have a simple button panel for choices of stops, which meant that you could push a button simply and go to your next stop without leaving the minecart, which was kind of annoying in the other stops on the rail. But that took a decent amount of redstone. I took some dark oak from a fellow bogus member, Check, and gathered basalts and nether brick from the nether and got to building. This time, following the vibe of nostalgia, I remembered that in Stampy Longnose's lovely world, his mob farm had a nether aesthetic to it, with fire and netherrack and all those kinds of features very much on display. I wanted the exterior of my mob farm to follow that aesthetic. Right next to the mob farm, I started working on the exterior of the train station. I very prominently used mud, which was a block I hadn't really experimented with up until this point. And now, along with creating a nostalgic, cozy atmosphere, I also wanted to have a chance to experiment with as many new blocks and new palettes as I could, as I traditionally stuck to pretty much 1 or 2 palettes. I set up rails for the train station in Hypatia, and the manager of the Klishkin rail, Klism, also rerouted the rail network to go through the station instead of awkwardly out through the sea. With the automatic rail switching 3 different possible stations, the Hypathian rail station was probably the coolest rail station in the whole network. Next, it was time for something big. The old gold farm I'd built in the previous episode had supplied me with all the golden XP that I needed for some time now, but it wasn't very well hidden, and quickly members of the nation of Lushile had found the farm and began using it, and soon enough the whole server would know where it was. Now, at this point, we were having very rocky relations with Lushile, and especially their allies, the Empire of Yolk, and tensions were only rising. Griefing was legal in the Nether, so if any kind of confrontation or war happened, they could attack the farm and single-handedly cripple our access to golden XP. We knew that we needed somewhere more secure and bigger. We decided to run with the gold farm designed by Nembon, which would allow us to apply looting to the piglins, getting crazy amounts of gold and even crazier amounts of XP. This was the first major collaborative build project between all the members of Bogus, which just shows how important this project was for us. We all scouted out a good location and gathered the materials together. I built up the custom storage system, which would dispense gold ingots into a collection chute into a hole we had in the bedrock where a future piglin bartering setup could be. I also built up the collection system, the drop chute, and the enchanter. The rest of the members finished off the spawning platforms, ghast proofing, pack spawning platform, and everything else. The next day, I helped with spawn proofing the areas above and below the bedrock, and I decided to use fire to do this, because piglins can only spawn at light level 11 or below, so I figured it could be a smart way to stop the spawning. And the farm worked like a charm. Next, I wanted to modernize my fish farm. Most of the storage that I had added in the beginning was a little redundant, so I shaved it down. Now I wanted to experiment with cherry and crimson for wood for this design, because I hadn't used much of those either. This farm, more than any other, was just wrapping the new exterior onto the old one, but quite frankly it still wasn't very easy. I chose a very unique palette using diorite and nether brick as well, and I had to redesign the window several times, but eventually I got it just the way I wanted, and it looked great in the city. Next up, I wanted to finish the gold farm by adding the bartering system onto the bottom. It was basically the exact same one I used on the old gold farm, but slightly cheaper. Now, the last project I would embark on to really open up the city would be a stadium for both PvP and Spleef. A few weeks before, the leader of Klishka, Klism, had asked the members of the server to provide venues for the first Olympics of the server, and I had signed up to be the venue for Spleef. Following with the nostalgic theme, I decided to base my stadium around the popular MMO's stadium that he used for his Lucky Block challenges, just because I'd seen that stadium so many times and I'd really like to be able to play inside of it myself. Unfortunately, for this video I was only able to have enough time to get the base platform done. Now Hypatia, and Bogus along with it, had risen, from ugliness and poverty to industrialization, capitalism, and modernity. Now, the future is uncertain. If our relations with the Empire of Yolk and Lushile continue to worsen, there is no telling where we'll go from here, but one thing is for certain. We're ready for all of it.